Thank you, Barbara. Spring outside, right? I think that's why we have the shades down. About that. Thanks for all being here. Let me say three quick things about our speaker. One, he is a hard worker. Probably about half of you in this room have already either had a meal with Neil. We put him to work. He's had a meal with our writers last night. He had a meal this morning with our political science students. And he had a meal at lunchtime with our pre-law students. He's done 2 lectures and agreed to do a third tomorrow morning before he leaves town. He had to spend time entertaining the president last night for a couple of hours, and he watched your entertainment last night. He was at Max Got Talent and saw some of our talent. So 1, he's a very hard worker. 2, he's clearly a very bright man. I got in trouble last night for saying that Neil was one of the 5 smartest people I've ever met. And of course, everyone else in the room said, well, are we the other 4? You know, don't go down that road, especially if your wife is one of the other 4 people. But he is a brilliant guy in many ways. He's had a long career already, 30 years, in both law and politics. After graduating from law school, he was a law clerk for a federal judge, Ralph Winters, on the U.S. Court of Appeals, the Second Circuit. That's the second highest court in our country. He was later an assistant United States attorney for the District of New Hampshire. He's tried cases all over the country in a 30-year career as a litigator, including prosecuting government claims resulting from the S&L crisis before most of you were born in the late 80s, representing telecom entrepreneurs in the 1990s, and most recently doing some groundbreaking work in defense of philanthropic entrepreneurs in the 2000s. Each of those were key series of litigation in those decades, and Neil was in the middle of all of them. He's also played an active role in his law career in the political area. I said earlier today, he's done everything from be the driver to be the candidate, twice a candidate for Congress in New York. You'll have no trouble figuring this out. He's a born and bred Brooklyn boy. He got a scholarship, went to Dartmouth College, is an honors graduate of that college. He also went to Yale Law School and is currently a senior partner with a law firm in New York. So 1, he's a hard worker. 2, he's a very bright guy, and it'll be interesting to hear from him. 3, and finally, I want to tell you, he's got a little bit of George Carlin about him. Anybody here know who George Carlin is? Very funny, very irreverent, sometimes almost taunting diatribes, humorous diatribes on people, on places, on things. And Neil's got a little bit of that braggadocio and a little bit of that swagger. But let me read you something that Carlin once said. He said, "The paradox of our time in history is that we have taller buildings, but shorter tempers, wider freeways, but narrower viewpoints. We spend more, but have less. We buy more, but enjoy less. We have bigger houses and smaller families, more conveniences, but less time. We have more degrees, but less sense, more knowledge, but less judgment, more experts, yet more problems, more medicine, but less wellness." That's all about paradox. And in his, I don't know which career it is for Neil, his 3rd or 4th, he's managed to turn that Carlin capacity for paradox into a mini career himself with his blog on Huffington Post. Some of you who had the chance to talk to him about that know both paradox and parody play a role in that. So there's a little bit about George Carlin, and I don't just mean the humor and the braggadocio, but Neil's insight into paradox and how to try to decide what is really true out there in that big wide world is a singular talent that he has. So we asked him to come here and address a very paradoxical statement, and that's an old line that Neil now tells me is historically incorrect from George Santayana, who said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So Neil, we thank you for putting in so much hard work since you came to this campus. We are delighted to have you, and thank you for taking on the task of dissecting George Santayana for us in this year's honors lecture.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the 20th century European philosopher Santayana once famously remarked that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Santayana intended that comment more as an insight into his theory of knowledge than as a guide to sound government policy. But as with many epigrammatic thinkers, prone to rendering what we today know of them as memorable sound bites, and Winston Churchill comes to mind as perhaps the class of this group. What is later attributed to these people is often different from what they attributed to themselves. And so it is with Mr. Santayana, Professor Santayana's famous epigram. It has been turned into a proverbial injunction against ignorance, especially for those who would sail the ship of state. And it has been rendered thusly: those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. Now, Santayana never said this, and according to his students, he never meant to. I, however, just have, and I intend it as the theme of my talk tonight on, broadly speaking, the state of American politics and policy. So, having sacrificed the backdrop of a famous philosopher, you will instead be treated to the remarks of a twice-failed congressional candidate, a practicing lawyer for almost 30 years, and an aficionado of today's blogosphere. In other words, me. I apologize in advance to both of you and to Professor Santayana. I want to begin by thanking Tom Foley for his kind introduction. I will repeat a line that he's used. He read the introduction just as my mother wrote it. I have known Tom from the first weekend I arrived at Dartmouth College in the fall of 1974, when I was affectionately introduced to a guy who everyone knew as Foles, and our paths have crossed continually since then, both at Yale Law School and in our later respective efforts to obtain public office. Fortunately for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, his efforts in that regard have been far more successful than mine. He has, in the past, used on a number of occasions that line being about me being among the 5 smartest people he knows, and I'm going to simply repeat tonight what I said when I first heard it. Tom really needs to get out more. My goal tonight is, I hope, somewhat modest, but nevertheless important. It is to first convince you that I'm correct in having located a problem in American politics and policy that seems to become more acute over the last 30 years. And it is second to suggest what perhaps may constitute the underlying causes of the disease in the hopes that we can begin to fashion a reasonable cure. So if, in the words of my George Santayana, those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it, the first question is a straightforward one. Is this statement true? In other words, can we find examples where history more or less has repeated itself, largely as a consequence of ignorance of the past? And let me begin by pointing out that the answer is not particularly obvious. No two eras are identical, and the challenges and problems of one do not necessarily mimic those of another, even where similarities abound. The problem, for example, of racism that Lincoln's America faced in 1860 is very different from the one faced by us in the middle to latter 20th century, even if both sets of problems were rooted in the same underlying moral error, namely the error that views race as a proper marker for worth and entitlement in character. It clearly is not. The problem of the 1860s was largely a rural and agricultural phenomenon. The problem of the mid to latter 20th century, one that had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution, external migration, the immigrations from Europe, and urbanization. So one can search the errors of the antebellum plantation South in Maine in looking for lessons that might apply, for example, to the Boston busing dispute in the 1970s. Nor does ignorance of the past as a precursor to mistakes in the present square particularly well with science, or for that matter, religion. In persuasively arguing the case for evolution, biologists, armed with a mountain of evidence, have made it clear that in the deep time of our evolutionary development, both we and our world have constantly adapted to changing circumstances and as a consequence survived. The lessons of evolution, or at least one of them, is that change is pretty much an inherent part of our DNA. That rather than having been defeated by the past, we have overcome it. Similarly, where science ends and theology starts, the possibility of transcendent improvement is ever present. In the religion that I share with the founders of this institution, the Christ who died for my sins nevertheless preached the possibility of redemption. And in one of the prayers I was taught, more or less before I learned much of anything else, we called it the act of contrition then. We asked for forgiveness while pledging to amend our lives. The pledge, of course, only makes sense if that is possible, but no theologian I know has ever disabused me of that possibility. So we return to our original question. Is it true? Is it really the case that those who refuse to study history are indeed condemned to repeat it? And I want to suggest tonight that it is. In fact, I want to convince you that it is a particularly acute problem today. And I want to begin by offering up what appear to me, at least to be the two best pieces of recent evidence of the truth of this proposition: the war in Iraq in 2003 and the financial meltdown in the fall of 2008. I am not the first, and certainly will not be the last, to suggest that the American policymakers made roughly the same set of mistakes in Iraq in the last decade that previous American policymakers made in Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 1960s. In both instances, there was a fairly gross misunderstanding of the problem. In Iraq, we thought Saddam Hussein had or was on the verge of having biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction, and perhaps even nuclear weapons, with which he then intended to threaten Israel and resurrect his grandiose visions of a Ba'athist Iraq as the preeminent regional power center. In Vietnam, in the 1950s and 1960s, we thought that an internal nationalist insurgency was in fact part of a Soviet and or Chinese-led communist conspiracy designed not to end European colonial dominance, but rather to establish a beachhead in Southeast Asia from which attacks could thereafter be launched against Thailand and the Philippines. Neither set of assumptions was correct. In Iraq, there were no weapons of mass destruction, and in Vietnam, there was no design on nations in the peninsula or outside it. Nor in Vietnam were the Chinese particularly instrumental in advancing the interests of the Vietnamese communists, a proposition that largely ignored the historic animosity between those two cultures. The similarities, moreover, don't end with false diagnoses of the problem at hand. In fact, they continue when we examine both the actual response to each potential conflict and the actual history that policymakers embraced each time in warning America not to hold back. Let's first examine the responses. In both cases, there was an enormous mismatch between the real problem and the means brought to bear against it. In Iraq, the actual military conflict lasted no more than a few weeks. The air assault paved the way for tanks and land troops, and Hussein's regime shortly fell and then disappeared once those troops reached Baghdad. Unfortunately, there was no real plan, and by that I mean no plan to preserve civil society, integrate the various conflicting groups of Sunnis and Shiites, and maintain order once that initially successful military phase had ended. The George W. Bush administration did not believe in nation building and therefore did not do it, at least not until General Petraeus convinced them to embrace a full-fledged counterinsurgency strategy in late 2007, early 2008. Before then, Iraq outside the Green Zone was a lawless state, run by competing and armed insurgent groups. It was an ersatz nation sunk into the veritable state of nature called to mind by that 16th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, namely a state in which for ordinary Iraqis, the life for ordinary Iraqis was, again quoting Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. Now in Vietnam, the mismatch between the problem and the response was more stark. In that case, there was no or little effort to rebuild villages or generate indigenous loyalties. In fact, for years, the only role we played was a military one, and American forces routinely fought and seized land, but no sooner having won, they retreated from, only to see the insurgents or the enemy return. Perhaps, however, the best parallel between Southeast Asia in the mid-20th century and Iraq in this one is the effort that policymakers made to convince us that those unwilling to fight were appeasing evil and making its ultimate triumph much more likely. For a large part of the past 40 years, appeasement itself has been the proverbial argument ender tossed at those who would shelve the military response. Typically, the anti-appeasement crowd waxes eloquent on the foibles and flaws of Europeans, Churchill excluded, who negotiated with Hitler in the 1930s as he seized nations in Central and Eastern Europe, finally and only choosing to confront him after he had invaded Poland in 1939. The ostensible lesson is that had the British and the French responded forcefully to Hitler when he rearmed, or when he seized Austria or Czechoslovakia, World War II could have been avoided. The anti-appeasers then fast-forward us to Southeast Asia in 1950-1960, or they fast-forward us to Iraq in 2003, and they warn us never to repeat the mistakes of the 1930s. Unfortunately, there was, and there is, one major flaw in this appeal to anti-appeasement, and that flaw was demonstrated in the run-up to Vietnam and in the run-up to Iraq. The flaw was that our ostensible targets, the communists in Vietnam and Hussein in Iraq, were not Adolf Hitler, and either were not being appeased or were not in need of confrontation. In Iraq, the Hussein that George W. Bush assailed in late 2002 had been defanged. A no-fly zone had been imposed on most of the country, and if necessary could have been imposed on the rest, thus ending any possibility that Hussein would have been able to mount his own assault against regime opponents, as he had in the immediate aftermath of Gulf War I. More to the point, we now know, and then we're in the process of getting the evidence, that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003. For purposes of the cat and mouse game that Hussein was playing with his Iranian enemies, he certainly tried to maintain the appearance of those weapons being available. But that's all it was. The weapons inspectors, led by Hans Blitz, did not find any weapons of mass destruction because there were none. So in short, by 2003, we and the rest of the West were not appeasing Saddam Hussein. We had beaten him and rendered him relatively harmless. This doesn't absolve him of his past sins. It does, however, make clear that the threat ostensibly present in March of 2003 was nothing like that posed by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. Indeed, in the 30s, Britain and France did not respond to Hitler until he had effectively seized almost all of Eastern Europe. In contrast, America and the West responded immediately in 1991 when Hussein seized Kuwait, reversed that illegal act, and then imposed an embargo that in fact eliminated WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq. Far from having appeased Hussein by March of 2003, we had effectively confronted and stopped him. Nor did the anti-appeasement argument turn out to have much force in Southeast Asia in the 50s and in the 60s. Remember, the supposed threat from communism in Vietnam was that it would inevitably spread to Thailand and then to the rest of Southeast Asia. Having lost Vietnam to the communists, however, the one thing we now know is that the predicted dominoes never fell. In fact, in view of how the economy in Vietnam has been organized, as well for that matter the economy of China, it's not all that clear that the dominoes fell all that far even in Vietnam and China. Each has embraced a form of capitalism, and while neither protects individual rights or minority rights in ways that you or I would find acceptable, neither is the equivalent of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union or Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. So, did history repeat itself in Iraq? I think it did. We went in on false pretenses. We're not prepared to fight the war that actually emerged, and had convinced ourselves before the fact that we faced a Churchillian choice between fighting on the one hand or the survival of evil incarnate on the other. We ignored the lesson, the example of Vietnam, where versions of the same mistake had been made 40 years earlier, and we embraced false parallels between the run-up to World War II and its actors and the personalities and dynamics of a very different part of the world with a very different set of personalities. And now I'd like to turn to the financial crisis of 2008. We have a pretty clear picture of what went wrong in the run-up to that crisis. And I want to suggest that in that case, the lessons of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, in particular, the regulatory lessons of that period, were lost on the current generation of policymakers. The basic story of the financial crisis is, as I've mentioned, fairly obvious. With the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which had created a wall of separation between commercial and investment banks, and a defanged, or at least fairly neutered, Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the entity that is supposed to investigate and govern the issues of securities and the trading of securities in the United States of America. The foundation had been laid for the creation and the exploitation of new investment vehicles. And Americans, captains of finance, did not disappoint us. They came up with a new collateralized debt obligation called the mortgage-backed security. The mortgage-backed security was, in essence, a bond, an IOU. It was created by buying up pools of mortgages, bundling those pools into a single security, and then selling that security for the reduced present value of a series of payments that would continue to be made on the mortgages by the homeowners who had taken them out. Now, creating and selling mortgage-backed securities became an enormously popular business in Wall Street in the early part of this century. And as with all lucrative businesses, Wall Street thought that more of a good thing would inevitably be, well, more of a good thing. So in addition to securitizing or monetizing mortgages, basically turning a revenue stream in the future into cash right then and there, they also decided to create instruments to insure those vehicles. And these instruments were known as credit default swaps. And they allowed anyone to go short or long on any mortgage-backed security. In other words, a holder of a mortgage-backed security could go into the market and basically buy protection against any decline in the value of that mortgage-backed security by entering into a credit default swap. He paid the issuer of that swap a fee, and the issuer agreed to pay him the value of the collateralized default obligation if there in fact was a default. Now, the banks which created and issued these instruments also got the private companies which rate the investment quality of bonds, Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch's, to rate the mortgage-backed securities as AAA, the highest investment grade, virtually risk-free. So at the end of the day, Wall Street had invented a new set of securities. And at the end of the day, they'd invented a new set of securities to, in effect, bet on the American housing market. They assumed that market would never implode all at once in the entire country. And Wall Street made this assumption because the American housing market had never before imploded all at once in the entire country, except for the one time when it did, during the Depression in the 1930s. But Wall Street assumed that would never happen again, except that it did, starting in 2006, and then with a vengeance in 2007 and 2008. Where did the financial gurus, Thomas Wolfe's proverbial masters of the universe, go wrong? Well, as it turned out, they went wrong when, having invented the mortgage-backed security and having decided how great it was, they needed to sell more houses so that more mortgages could be issued on those houses and more mortgage-backed securities fashioned out of those mortgages. This led to the creation of enormous mortgage issuers, like Countrywide, who were in turn followed by the quasi-private but more or less government-guaranteed mortgage lenders, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, conservatives today like to say that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac caused the real estate bubble because they issued all of those subprime loans. That is false. The giants like Countrywide and their peers started the subprime mortgage ball rolling long before Fannie and Mae got into the game of trying to catch up. And in any case, with mortgage-backed securities needing more mortgages or home buyers, the subprime mortgage industry was born. No money down loans, no income, no asset loans, low teaser interest rates followed shortly by increases, and perhaps the mother of all free lunches, the home equity line of credit, which allows anyone who has a home to treat that home as a credit card. My mother once told me that if something looks too good to be true, it isn't. This looked too good to be true, and it wasn't. Now remember, all of these mortgages being turned into mortgage-backed securities were all being rated as AAA investments, and then in effect insured via those credit default swaps that Wall Street had also invented. Whoever issued the actual home loans never owned them for more than a brief period of time, because they had to be sold to the bundlers to create the securities. So no one had all that much of an incentive to check out the borrowers. Now, most of you in this room have never had this experience, but if you ask your grandparents what it was like to get a mortgage to buy a house when they did it, chances are they will compare the process unfavorably to a dental root canal procedure. In the days before Ninas, no interest, no asset loans, and teaser rates, and home equity lines, when banks existed just to make loans to purchases in the neighborhood, in fact, those banks were called savings and loan institutions, but they've gone the way of the woolly mammoth. The due diligence done by loan officers rivaled that of the FBI solving a major murder. In short, the loan officer made sure the homeowner could repay the loan. He got the borrower's job history, their income history, their financial statements, and a substantial down payment of at least 20% of the purchase price. He knew the neighborhood, probably even the actual house, where the market stood, and where it was likely to go. He also owned the loan after it was issued and was on the hook until the loan was repaid by the borrower or the home was sold and the loan was repaid as part of the sale. That usually took years, not days. None of this, moreover, was by accident. In the wake of the Depression in the 30s, the government had separated commercial and investment banks so that one could not be in the business of the other, and it had created regulatory bodies like the Securities and Exchange Commission and laws requiring full and complete disclosure so as to avoid a repeat of what had occurred in the run-up to the Great Depression, namely the issuance of speculative stocks sold in unregulated markets where issuers manipulated trading and buyers were allowed to go into extreme hock to purchase their securities. The government did this to save Wall Street from itself and us from them. Now, credit is the lifeblood of any mature industrial or post-industrial society. Without it, the economic gears come to a grinding halt. And when Wall Street hits the panic button, following a bust in the wake of one of its self-generated bubbles under which there is no value, as it did after the stock market crash in 1929, and as it was in the process of doing in September 2008, after the real estate implosion rendered worthless those mortgage-backed securities and then triggered the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman and AIG. When all that happens, when the water goes over the fall, private credit dries up. The antidote to this problem on the back end is the government. The government comes in and floods the system with liquidity and basically saves the day. Now, I call this downside communism. I call it downside communism because even though the prior gains were privatized by all those hedge fund guys who got the money, the subsequent losses are pretty much socialized. All of us bear them. That's downside communism. But here's where our policymakers went wrong. And here's where they forgot the lessons of Roosevelt's New Deal and the lessons of the Depression. The government can be, and should be, and for years has been, the antidote on the front end of this process as well. It can regulate the securities markets. It can separate, and did separate for years, the commercial and investment banks so that neither becomes greedy for the other's franchise. It can create rules of the road to enforce prudent lending and eliminate speculative excess. We did this in the 1930s in the wake of the Depression. For much of the last 30 years, however, we've been tearing down the regulatory scaffolds and armed with a rhetoric that makes all regulation bad and all markets happily free, we've left the titans of finance to their own devices. The irony is that we expected a different result when we unshackled them in the last 30 years from the one we got when they were unshackled in the first third of the 20th century. In fact, that is the irony in refusing to study history. The neoconservatives, who told us that we would be greeted with flowers when we liberated Iraq, expected a result different from the predictable and predicted result they got, the one portended by our prior venture in Southeast Asia. And so did the titans of finance, who invented and sold esoteric securities and then invented the housing bubble of the last 10 years. Ignored history, I submit, does repeat itself. But the history that repeats itself is often recent history. We're not making the same mistakes made by the papacy in the Middle Ages or the British in 19th century Ireland or even by ourselves in the run-up to the Civil War. Our times are different from those. But our times are not that different from the 1950s and the 60s when it comes to fighting a land war in Asia or the Middle East, which is probably why Defense Secretary Gates recently said that the next Secretary of Defense who advises an American president to fight such a war in either place should, and I quote, have his head examined, close quote. And our times aren't that much different from the 1920s and the 1930s when it comes to finance capital. The financial instruments are certainly more complex, but the motives of the various participants are the same. I have now been practicing law on or close to Wall Street for much of the past 30 years, and I am certain of at least this much. To a man, and now to a woman as well, finance capitalists will play the game by the rules as written. They will look for loopholes, and they will push the envelope. They will not, either out of a sense of utility or as a matter of morality, follow any unwritten traditions that limit their opportunities. And they are not in the game, as it were, to do good or to get to heaven. They are in it to make money. If government decides to repeal the rules or otherwise suspends them through non-enforcement, the financiers are not going to step into the breach. If risk can be offloaded, it will be. If rewards can be monopolized, they will be. Pure capitalism is, in my mind, a dog-eat-dog arrangement where a few win, many lose, and some barely survive. It does not create a middle class or even a democracy, as we now are learning from the many autocracies that nevertheless adhere to market and capitalist principles: the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Indonesians. Regulated capitalism, however, is a different and, in my mind, much more useful beast. It is capable of taking a long view and of generating gains through productivity, which, as far as gains go, isn't the whole story. That's a large part of it. Regulated capitalism is also capable of building a middle class, which is not a sufficient condition for democratic rights in politics, but is certainly a necessary one. Economic historians have now taken to calling the period from just after World War II to the mid-1970s the Great Compression. And this is because that period, alone in post-industrial America, saw the enormous productivity gains of the post-war economy distributed much more evenly and gave birth to the modern middle class. Unfortunately, what has occurred in the last 30 years is more of a replay of the Gilded Age of the 19th century. The productivity gains from the computer age went largely to the top. In fact, they went largely to the top of the top, the wealthiest 1%. The poor got poorer, the middle class shrank and barely held its own. In late 2008, America's second Gilded Age seemed to be going the way of the first. As finance capital imploded and the contradictions brought on by speculative and unregulated excess, America stood on the brink of a second Great Depression. We avoided that fate only because we were willing to bail out the banks and add enormous sums to our national debt. The hangover, however, has been very painful, and though it is not as enormous a calamity as the one we faced in the 1930s, it is second only to it. Real unemployment, which counts all who are out of work, not just those who are out and still looking, is still in the 15% range and was higher at the peak of the crisis. In this near depression, it has become fashionable to condemn public debt and even more fashionable to condemn public employees and the unions that support them. That was the fashion in 1937 as well. And when we succumbed to it, we suffered a second mini-depression that was not ended until the mother of all fiscal stimulus programs came online, which we know today as World War II. So even here, there is a lesson in the perils of refusing to study history. Unions were as responsible as any other institution for the Great Compression that created the middle class. If we eliminate them and succumb to the deficit reduction mania now sweeping Washington and many state capitals, a mania, by the way, that was totally absent when the economy was growing and many of those same maniacs held power, we could pull demand right out of our rather anemic present recovery and throw ourselves back into the straits we were in 2 years ago. In short, we can again refuse to study history and again repeat it. So it does not surprise me that my George Santayana had a point. Yet I am still struck by the obviousness of this result, and so have wondered of late why it still happens. And here let me suggest a different set of problems, one that you all are uniquely positioned to combat in this institution of higher learning. It is this. We have, I fear, become a nation and a culture where anti-intellectualism is on the rise. In our politics, spin has replaced substance, fiction has often replaced fact, and theatrical performance has replaced accomplishment. In the campaigns we regularly see transpire for the presidency and other political offices high and low. Most people now abhor politics, and the policymakers who emerge are, in far too many cases, as cynical as the culture producing them. In the prior administration, for example, insiders bragged to complaining journalists that those journalists were part of the reality-based media, and that they, the policymakers, would just invent a new reality once the one they were in caught up to them. Similarly, one of the major party candidates for vice president often seems proud of what she does not know and has openly wondered whether these so-called facts and figures of policy really matter anymore in American politics. This is dangerous, and it is catching. Millions of people each day tune into talking heads on the AM radio dial who are literally spewing lies. Yet the fact that millions are tuning into them has turned those liars into millionaires and, in some cases, actual conglomerates. When I was growing up in Brooklyn 40-plus years ago, getting a college degree was a dream. When it happened, my grandparents shed tears of joy. Nowadays, however, someone with my education is called an elitist if he runs for office while speaking incomplete sentences, or criticizes arguments against global warming as based on neither fact nor science, or, heaven forbid, suggests that billionaire hedge fund managers are undertaxed, or third-grade teachers underpaid. We have become two Americas, the very rich and the very rest. But I bet if you took a poll on the person who pointed that out the most over the course of the last 10 years, a guy by the name of John Edwards, people would know a lot more about his unfortunate sex life than they knew about the programs he advocated. As I say, all this is very dangerous. Dangerous because it makes ignorance something to brag about rather than avoid or overcome. Because it almost guarantees we will not learn from the past or even make any particular effort to try. I want to be clear about this. I'm not saying that I am smarter than Sarah Palin. At some level, we are all ignorant. Okay, maybe I am. At some level, we are all ignorant, and in any case, learning is a lifelong ambition. None of us will ever know it all. I am, however, saying, and I'm very serious about this, that recognizing ignorance, in whatever sphere it manifests itself, is no excuse to wallow in it, especially if you plan to do the wallowing in the White House. So to all of you, but especially to the students who are here tonight and are the mission of this college, my message is simple. Do not wallow. Absorb the wisdom that is around you and in you. And when you leave, make it your ambition to keep learning. And if you ever think that the country is seriously off on the wrong track, run for Congress. President Obama is right when he says that we are the future we have been waiting for. And you are that we. So finally, if you decide to do that, please call me up. We will have a nice chat about George Santayana. Thank you very much.